So, our final speaker today needs no introduction, but he's going to get one anyway. He has been in nationalism for over 20 years, and there isn't much that he hasn't seen. He is the founder and the leader of the largest nationalist organisation in the United Kingdom, and he has led Patriotic Alternative with both wisdom and courage, and without his efforts, none of us would be here today. So please put your hands together and give a hearty round of applause for the one and only Mark Collett.
Firstly, before I start speaking, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who came here today. To see us packing out a room like this for what, the 5th year in a row is incredible. The momentum we've built and the momentum we've maintained over the last 5 years, people often credit to me. But it's not really me who did this. It's us. So when people are giving myself a round of applause, I do appreciate that. But the round of applause should be extended to everyone who is part of our community. Because first and foremost, that is what Patriotic Alternative is all about. Now, there's an overused analogy that I'm sure that everyone in this room will be familiar with. And that analogy is about boiling a frog. But in case you're the one person in the room that hasn't heard of this analogy before, it's based around the idea that if you were going to boil a frog, which I don't recommend, by the way, but if you were, and you were going to boil that frog alive in a pan of water, you're better off putting the frog in cold water, placing the pan on the stove, and gently turning up the heat so the frog doesn't know that it's being boiled alive until it's too late. The converse of this is, of course, you just throw the frog into a pan of bubbling water on the stove and it jumps right out and it escapes. Now, obviously, everyone in this room today can understand why this analogy has been used so often, as it clearly applies directly to the struggle that we are in. Since 1945, there have been sweeping changes to almost every aspect of British life. And if you took a snapshot of Britain in, let's say, 1950, and compared it to the Britain that we live in today, I think we'd all agree it's night and day. It would be like comparing cool, fresh water from a stream with bubbling hot water sat in a pan on a stove. And we didn't go from 1945 to 2024 in a heartbeat, or even in a short period of time. It took us over 3/4 of a century. That's longer than the average lifespan of the people who were alive when all of those changes were set in motion. The changes were drip-fed to the public. And in terms of the analogy that I began with, the analogy of the frog in the pan, the heat was turned up so very slowly over such a lengthy period of time. But here today, in Britain, in 2024, I finally think that the overused analogy of the frog being boiled is starting to lose its relevance. As since the election of Keir Starmer and the current Labour government, The heat has been turned up so quickly that I think it would be impossible for anyone not to notice. In fact, the heat has been turned up so quickly that nearly everyone is talking about it. Now, as people have said, I've been around for a long time, and it was once common for nationalists like myself who engaged with the public to be turned away or dismissed on the grounds that we were talking nonsense. I've spent over 2 decades trying to convince the public of both the reality and the gravity of the situation that we as a race and nation face. I have first-hand knowledge of the way the public dismissed us. Believe it or not, there was once a time when you could speak to members of the public and they didn't believe mass immigration was even an issue. And they certainly would not have entertained the idea that white Britons would ever have faced the prospect of being a minority in their ancestral homeland. What's more, if you tried to inform people that as this process would take place, not only would white Britons be the ones to pay financially for the transition, but during that transition, they would become an underclass. Many people used to roll their eyes. They would even laugh and mock you for what you were saying. To many, the future that we warned of was simply preposterous. It was a fantasy. Or worse still, it was a conspiracy theory. And I've had that argument thrown into my face more times than I care to remember. But over the last 3.5 months, things have changed dramatically. There has been a massive, a seismic political shift in Britain. A shift that has been overseen and stage managed by what is undoubtedly the most nakedly anti-white and pro-migrant government this country has ever seen. One that puts both the Blair and Sunak regimes to shame. And this shift is the equivalent of turning up the heat under the pan, not by several degrees, but by such a factor that the frog immediately takes note. Who would have thought back in June that less than 4 months later we would have seen the murder of 3 little white girls by the son of migrants, spontaneous mass anti-migrant protests on the streets of cities the length and breadth of the country, a brutal police clampdown like nothing we have ever witnessed before, 24-hour politicized courts being convened to deal with speech and thought criminals. The Prime Minister going on television to tell us he's forming special police forces to simply focus on internet hate crimes. New legislation is now being drafted to criminalize those who speak out against migration. But on top of all of that, there is a raft of new economic cash grabs, including a discriminatory policy that withdraws vital winter fuel payments from over 10 million overwhelmingly white pensioners in order to ensure that a raft of diverse and progressive policies can still be funded. But whilst all this is happening, whilst Labour is stripping us of our rights and signing off on what could effectively be a policy that leads to a cull of elderly white Britons, they've also been preparing an amnesty for over 100,000 illegal immigrants, as well as removing the final few remaining blockades to migrants entering the country. And all these new Britons, they're going to be granted the right to stay here. They won't be facing the same financial crisis that us true Brits will, as Labour is committed to spending millions, if not billions, on making sure these people are cared for in every way imaginable. And I have to emphasise this again. This is all within 4 months of Starmer being elected. They've not just turned up the temperature a little, they've gone straight to gas mark 10 in the blink of an eye. And on top of that, they're not even trying to hide it. Now, at one time, governments, especially the Conservatives, always the Conservatives, would usually dangle a carrot in order to soften the blow. But the current Labour establishment are so totally shameless and anti-white that they don't even do that. Things have changed so much so that I don't think going up to people and talking about migration and the idea of whites becoming a minority would be something that anyone contested anymore. Now, sure, I think you would find liberals out there, and those liberals would say, yeah, the demographic shift is happening, and they'd be celebrating it. But they'd still admit that it was happening. They would say they celebrated it rather than denying it. But more importantly than accepting the facts on migration, which are of course important, is the fact that people are now aware that we live under a two-tier system. A two-tier system is in place where the indigenous people of these islands are automatically placed at a disadvantage when compared to both new arrivals and those from ethnic minority backgrounds. Now, granted, the rules are a little more complex than what I've just stated. Obviously, white Britons who are part of the ruling elite, whites who are part of far-left organisations, or whites who are part of degenerate, sickening subcultures will get a pass. But normal, white, working folk are now clearly second-class citizens. And worse still, if you are white, and if you're speaking out against mass immigration, multiculturalism, or talking about demographic change, you will be treated as the lowest of the low. And you will have fewer rights than any other group in the country. Now, this in itself is not news to anyone in this room. We've known this was coming for a long time. We know if a member of an anti-fascist organisation punches someone, the police don't care. If a nationalist defends himself and it's self-defence, you're getting arrested. If a young black male sets fire to the Union Jack at the cenotaph, it's a suspended sentence. If a young white male kicks a police van because 3 little white girls were murdered, it's off to jail for 26 months. And again, this isn't news to us. We've seen this creeping up. We've known this was coming for years, and we've spent, some of us, decades trying to warn the public. But in the last few months, the dam has finally broken when it comes to talking about this issue. The issue of two-tier policing has gone mainstream. The term has been used in Parliament, in the media, and in almost every major newspaper. The heat has been turned up so quickly that not even the press can deny what is happening, and the public are no longer deriding or ignoring what we say. They are openly voicing our talking points, which are increasingly coming part of the everyday discourse in workplaces, in social clubs, in pubs, and in homes all over Britain. This is a watershed moment for nationalists here in the UK. And it represents not some small or incremental shift, but a massive jump. But that jump, before you all start celebrating, presents both great opportunities, but also serious dangers. And let's start with the good stuff. Let's start with the opportunities. Never before has immigration been such a hot topic. Never before have so many people been openly concerned about demographic change. And this isn't just reflected in the way normal people are speaking. We've seen a massive change in the way that formerly race-blind politicians, content creators, and influencers are reporting on the issue of immigration and anti-white policy making. All of a sudden, there is a palpable fear about the prospect of the UK becoming a country where the indigenous population are a minority. And there is also this growing concern of how white people would be treated if they were a minority. Even Nigel Farage has finally spoken about the ethnic makeup of our cities and even made an election pledge about deporting people. Finally, the world is accepting the talking points that we have pushed for generations. The truth is breaking through. However, we should not rejoice too much, because there's a lot of negatives to this as well. And the obvious negative is the way that Keir Starmer and the Labour government are approaching this mass awakening. In short, they are set on two courses of action. The first is that they wish to accelerate mass immigration into Britain. The establishment have clearly acknowledged that there is a race going on between migration and the public consciousness of migration. On one hand, migration is increasing, but on the other, the public are now more aware that migration is this big threat and that it affects their lives in so many ways. The race taking place now will decide whether whites will become a minority before they become racially conscious enough on a wide enough scale to prevent themselves from becoming a minority. And the establishment is not run by idiots. They know how crucial this race is. Starmer and his cabinet know that if white people were to wake up before they were outnumbered, the game is up. Migration is ending, it will be reversed, and we will remain a majority. On the other hand, conversely, they also know if they can increase migration and whites slip under a certain percentage of the population, it's effectively game over. white Britons at that point will be destined to minority status. So the first course of action that the Starmer government will be set upon is to speed up white replacement to levels that we have never seen before. And on top of all of that, they have something going in their favour. They already know that we're reaching that tipping point, that the point of no return is not very far off at this juncture. With hundreds of thousands of white Britons leaving the country every year to run from this nightmare, with millions of migrants coming in, with birth rates being overwhelmingly in favour of migrant communities, they will surely at this point think that victory is in their grasp. And if you want a bit of perspective on this isn't just me saying this, I'm going to give you the latest figures. It was either this week or last week a report was published. Over the last 12 months, for the first time since 1976, deaths outstripped births here in the UK. Now, you don't have to be a genius to work out that should lead to a falling population, yes? But over the same 12 months, our population grew by the fastest rate it ever has in history. We cannot hide from the fact that we are now being replaced faster than we ever have before. Now, you think that's bad. But their second, and I said that was the first course of action. Their second course of action is actually worse than the first. And I know what you're thinking. How on earth could something be worse than speeding up mass immigration to the point where we become a minority even faster? Well, it's simple. Their second course of action is to effectively terrorize white people, so that even if whites become racially conscious on a much, much larger scale, most of those who understand the truth will be too scared, too browbeaten to ever speak out about the issue, effectively meaning that the racially conscious white Britons will sit in silence rather than stand up and join our chorus of dissent. Now, the astute amongst you will have noticed I used a term there. I said terrorise. And I used that term for a specific reason. You see, whilst the government loves to use the word terrorism to describe those who espouse views that they don't like, there is a bitter irony to them using that word in such a way. You see, the words terrorism and terrorist came into English use as translations of words used in France during the period known as the Reign of Terror. That took place between 1793 and 1794. And during that era, the newly installed French government punished, usually by death, those people who were thought to be against the ongoing revolution. Those words came into existence thanks to a gruesome and protracted period of state-sponsored violence. It's quite amazing, really. The words terrorism and terrorist were originally words used to describe brutal acts of oppression by the state directed against those who spoke out against the state. Or in many cases, those acts of brutal oppression were used against people who were merely perceived to be going against the state. And that is exactly what we're seeing here now in Britain. When you see mothers dragged out of their homes for social media posts, when you see working men sent to prison for shouting at police officers, and when you see hard-working fathers jailed for minor offences like throwing a traffic cone towards police officers, you know we are living in times of political oppression that can only be described as state-sponsored terror. We are moving toward a point where holding the wrong opinions will be seen as almost a capital crime, where saying the wrong words to the wrong person will see you receive a sentence longer than what a sex offender would receive. And this worrying shift towards a complete and total clampdown on freedom of speech and freedom of expression is exactly what I would have predicted from this Labour government. And this clampdown has the potential to be the most comprehensive in history, because it is backed by a surveillance state that is unrivaled. But just as worryingly, it will also be supported by the same disgusting, snivelling people who snitched on their neighbours during the COVID lockdowns. The kind of people who phoned the police when people on their street didn't come out of their homes at the allotted time to clap like demented seals for the NHS. Make no mistake, we are now presented with the greatest opportunity that nationalists have seen in a lifetime. But we are also presented with the most draconian laws, the most oppressive system, and a surveillance network that makes anything written in 1984 look like a joke. But the talk of this takes me back to a different time, a time when I was a young man, and how politics was when I first joined this struggle. When I first got involved, I joined the BNP. And at the time, the BNP was trying to hide their remigration policy. The party played down talk of sending people home. We never spoke of it. We never featured it in publicity material. And we actually treated it as if it was our dirty little secret. It was something that we spoke of behind closed doors. I remember the BNP's we called it the repatriation policy. And the party watered it down, hid it on their website, and had a policy of never speaking about it, never putting it on leaflets, never talking about it at meetings, and definitely never ever mentioning it in a media interview. Today, however, several decades on, remigration is a buzzword. For the first time in my lifetime, remigration is a rallying cry that is posted tens of thousands of times a day on social media. Deportation is demanded by sitting MPs. Normal people are discussing sending them back. Remigration for the first time in a generation is seen not just as a viable solution, but as a necessary solution. Remigration is not just the battle cry of nationalists, but something that normal people are now openly desiring. Remigration is now rightly seen as the only solution that can save us from becoming a minority. It is what we need in order to survive. But before we celebrate and before we cheer, there's a flip side to that. Remigration is also a term that could soon become illegal. Calls for remigration and deportation could well be outlawed as terms that are likely to stir up racial hatred. And I say likely because that is the new word. That will be the new bar when deciding whether speech is hate speech. At one time, speech would have to be abusive, insulting, or threatening. But now, the Labour government wish to change this to the lower threshold of merely likely to stir up racial hatred. So on one hand, we see a golden opportunity. We see progress, and we see the public increasingly accepting our talking points in larger and larger numbers. And most of all, we're finally seeing remigration being discussed, normalised, and even adopted in other Western nations. But on the other hand, we have these draconian laws, a surveillance state, two-tier justice, and a clampdown on our freedoms that even George Orwell would never have predicted. Make no mistake, my friends, this is a high-stakes game. Everything is on the line. All the chips are on the table. And we stand to gain everything. But we also stand to personally forfeit everything if the state singles us out for persecution. And I'm not going to stand here and lie to you. The risk is real. There are people now in jail cells serving multi-year sentences for saying the wrong thing, attending the wrong protest, or even publishing stickers that the Crown stated were completely legal. So, the question that people will ask me is, where do we go from here? Well, we are going to do something that no other group has ever attempted to do here in the UK. Firstly, we will remain as the community building group we have always been. At the centre of everything we do will remain this community. But we will become an Indigenous rights advocacy and pressure group. The only group in the UK that will fight for the rights of the Indigenous people of this country who face discrimination, abuse, or even jail. We will use this community that we have built to be both a support network and a shield wall for those whom the system attacks. And the thing that makes me the most proud is that we've already begun doing this. Since the recent anti-migrant protests, we as a community have already raised £15,000 for the families of those who have been jailed for either speech crimes, non-crimes, such as shouting at the police, or being present when disorder took place, and for people who were jailed for minor infractions. And this is a bold move, not just because no one else is doing it, but also because I believe it's the one thing our people need the most. They need a community that stands behind them when the state comes knocking on their door. But that sadly brings me to the most uncomfortable part of what I'm going to say today. With this clampdown, with this high-stakes battle for our future, with tensions in the country reaching boiling point, and with political persecution reaching levels that we have never seen before, I expect that some people who were once very active in this movement will take their leave. The idea of going to jail or becoming a social pariah will simply be too much for them. These people will look at political prisoners like Sam Melia, and whilst they'll admire them and want to support them, they will be terrified of being in their shoes. Some people will now decide certain things can't be discussed. They will quietly fall in line with the government's new mandates, and they will behave like trained dogs, understanding exactly what their masters expect of them. But I'm sure there's a question here for me. What will I do? And I say I because I am speaking for me. And on this topic, I can't speak for you. But I will carry on despite the associated risks, because I believe more than anything that what we do is right. And people have asked me this. And when I say people, I mean members of the public, people in this room, my friends, even my family. They've said, Mark, is this worth going to jail for? Was this all worth losing your bank accounts? Was this all worth becoming a social pariah that can't do many of the things that normal people do? And I look at them and smile and say, the answer is unequivocally yes. You see, sometimes in life, there are bigger things at stake than your own individual well-being, your own financial security, and your own social status. From a young age, I acknowledged that the most important thing was the survival of people of European descent. I acknowledged that if we as a people cease to exist, anything that I achieve as an individual in my life would be irrelevant. And now I look at the current situation, and I know the risks are greater than ever. I know the establishment will continue to tighten the noose around our necks, choking our freedoms. But I have done this for long enough to know that the establishment's actions do not come from a place of strength. Instead, they come from a place of fear and uncertainty. The establishment knows that the cracks in the multicultural project are growing by the day. And that's why they are desperate to pass these new laws, as they know the truth is breaking through. And their only hope now is not to hide the truth, because they can't do that anymore. Their only hope now is to stop people speaking the truth that they already know. They aren't jailing nationalists because they're winning. They are jailing nationalists because they're finally losing their grasp on power. And that's why, at this crucial juncture, despite the increased risks, I believe it is time to grit our teeth, to dig our heels in and fight harder. But what about our freedom? People will cry. Well, the answer to that is simple. Being free is about being able to live as you wish, being able to say what you want, to be able to do what you please, and to associate with those whom you love. If you can't do those things, if you choose to self-censor, and if you give up on your beliefs, if you are forced to turn your back on your comrades and friends, one thing is for sure: you are not free. You are a prisoner in their system. But worse still, you are a prisoner by consent. And I, for one, am not going to consent to being a prisoner of their system. I do not consent to spending my life on my knees for anyone, especially not a system that despises me, my family, my friends, and my people. My message today is clear. Despite the hardships, despite the increasing oppression, and despite what may seem like overwhelming odds, we will never be silenced. But more so, we will give a voice to those who the system tries to silence. We will be the support network for the most oppressed, trampled people in this country. White people who dare to oppose their own replacement. We are engaged in this struggle because we understand one thing. The most precious thing in the whole world is our people. And the survival of our people is non-negotiable. So despite the increasing tyranny that we face, we will never stop fighting. And even if our brave comrades are arrested and dragged away from their families and imprisoned, their heads will not be bowed. Their flame will not dim, and they will not be forgotten. Quite the opposite, in fact. Their heads will be held up high. Their names will be known by more people than they could ever have imagined. Their fight against this system will be spoken of, not only the length and breadth of the country, but it will be spoken of all over the Western world, because those who dare to fight in the darkest of times are the heroes that will ensure that tomorrow belongs to us. Thank you.
Collett.